What is an early memory you have that potentially sparked your interest in the computer science or education field?
Wow. Oh, that's a great question. First time I seriously saw a computer do something amazing, I was a high school student, and I guess that's probably going to be around 1963, I guess. And I was at a science fair. I think they held the science fair at West Point at the Military Academy in New York. And we took a day trip as part of that science fair to IBM Research in Yorktown Heights, New York. I remember sitting in a big auditorium there with all of these other science fair kids. And Arthur Samuel, who was a computing pioneer, demonstrated his checkers playing program. Early beginnings of artificial intelligence that the computer could play checkers. By definition, it's memorable. I'm 76 years old now, and I remember it very distinctly. The other half of your question, so, one thing led to another. I could tell some other stories about my early contacts with computing, but you also said interest in education. And the strange thing about that is that I never really intended to be an educator. I was always the kid that my high school classmates called when they needed help on their physics problems, so I got used to explaining mathy problems and how to solve them to my friends. But when I was in graduate school, I assumed I was going to go off and be an engineer, and I was going to work for IBM or someplace like that, computer applications or computer software of some kind. But it just so happened my wife was also in a PhD program, and hers was taking longer than mine was taking. And, there was a junior faculty position at Harvard available at the time, and she was a graduate student at Harvard. So I kind of took the professor job just to kill for time for a couple of years until my wife got out of graduate school. And, one thing led to another. I loved doing it, and I've never left.
Your proposal that separated Harvard's computer science program from their applied mathematics program in the late 1970s, what was the process like for the computer science major to come to fruition for undergraduate students?
Right. So we sit here in what's now called a School of Engineering. When I was an undergraduate, it's called a Division of Engineering and Applied Physics, but, same idea. There were computer science courses, and increasingly during the 1970s, more and more students got interested in taking these courses. But there were very few computer science faculty. Most of the faculty were applied mathematicians, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and so on. I was a junior faculty member. I didn't have tenure yet. It was 1978, and I remember this very distinctly. And the time had come, I decided that Harvard should have its own computer science major. Princeton had a computer science major. There were other schools with which we competed and considered ourselves comparable. I remember going into a faculty meeting of the Division of Engineering and Applied Physics, and proposing that we should have a separate computer science major rather than making the computer science-y students major in applied mathematics or engineering. One of my senior colleagues in mechanical engineering, a guy who was probably 40 years older than I am, took a cigar out of his mouth. You could smoke in those days, and grimaced contemptuously and said, "Computer science major? We've never had an automotive science major. Why would we have a computer science major?" As far as he was concerned, a computer was just something to solve his problems, and you needed programmers, but it wasn't an independent scientific field. So I retreated, being a junior member of the faculty, and waited a few years until my position there was more secure, and brought it up again in 1981 or 82. And by that time, the student interest was so overwhelming, and others began to recognize that it really was an independent discipline. But the result was that Harvard was a little late in actually adopting computer science as its own discipline and awarding degrees in the field under that name.
What were some of your biggest challenges as the Dean of Harvard College from 1995 to 2003?
Being the Dean of any college is something different every day. You never know what incident is going to occur and is going to blow up and cause spectacular controversy about something which the day before hadn't been controversial at all. Many of the things that took a lot of time in those days are the same things that deans have to worry about now. I remember spending a lot of time on alcohol problems, particularly surrounding football games and other big festivals. Students get drunk and wound up hospitalized. I'm not a teetotaler. I'm a healthy drinker myself, but partly what was happening is that students had very little experience drinking when they come to college, and they don't know how serious a large amount of alcohol consumed in a short amount of time can be. So we had some very serious incidents where students were wound up hospitalized and intubated and so on because they were so drunk. We were rearranging the housing system. I had taken the initiative in getting the Harvard housing system. Almost all Harvard students live on campus. Undergraduate students live on campus. Getting all of the housing housing units, what Harvard calls houses, to kind of have comparable services. We were adjusting then, as we still are, how to deal with some very serious problems about student safety and sexual assault, and how do you fairly adjudicate an issue of when a student alleges that she's been raped and by another undergraduate, and how do you be fair to both parties and so on. Those things are still very difficult questions, so they certainly took up a lot of my time. In general, there were good things I was worrying about also, about how to make the place run better.
What does a regular Harry Lewis class look like? For anyone who has not attended a class of yours, can you paint a picture for the outsiders looking in?
What a lovely question. So I've been teaching for 50 years at Harvard. This is exactly the end of my 50th year. And I've taught every kind of class. And if you ask my students from 40 years ago what the answer to that question is, they would give you a very different answer than the answer that I'm going to give you, which describes how I'm teaching now. I used to be a very, very good lecturer. And about 15 years ago, I realized that my lectures were just as good as they ever had been, but no one was coming to them anymore. And the reason students weren't coming to them is because they were all video recorded and they were all live streamed and they could watch them in bed. And why should they drag themselves to my lecture hall in the snowy drifts of January when they could stay in bed and roll over after I'd finished, or better yet, watch it whenever they woke up. I'm an information libertarian. I wasn't going to stop recording the lectures. Those have their useful purposes, even if students use them for the less useful purpose of sleeping a little longer. I completely stopped lecturing, and everything I teach now, I teach in some kind of discussion format. Either a flipped classroom, if I'm teaching something that's more of a quantitative subject and we get together and we solve problems around the table in a flat floor classroom, or the course I'm teaching now, which is a kind of discussion course for upper level undergraduates in computer science. We read, in the course of one semester, 50 classic papers of the field. We read 2 a day. We meet twice a week, and for about 13 weeks, it works out to be about 50 papers. We read the papers, we come in, I riff for 10 or 15 minutes. I know some of the authors of these or knew them while they were alive, and I try to set the context about how they related to the times they were written, what the influence of the Second World War was, or what the information of the internet was on other areas of computer science. So I talk about that a little bit so that students kind of get a way of integrating their experience in the field. And then we break up into little tables with 6 students around the table. I and some of my teaching assistants wander around from the tables and join the conversations. But it's very, very discussion oriented now, and students actually do a lot of the teaching to each other. I think it's a fun format.
Do you believe Harvard should make their curriculum less rigorous and taxing for the students?
Your question kind of has a presumption in it that it's rigorous and taxing for students as it is. I don't think it's terribly rigorous or taxing.
The workload has to be just down bad for a good part of the week. Friday and Sunday rolls around and it's better, but yeah.
Academics are difficult and challenging, but that's sort of what you get when you come here.
Would you prefer a less rigorous academic curriculum?
Not really.
That's a good question. No, I like that it keeps me busy and on my toes. Sometimes it feels like a lot, but at the end of the day, I always do it. So it's clearly I can handle it. I just have to figure out first of all, time management, get better at that, and then figure out what to prioritize. But I like it.
Depends on who you ask and what program, but I guess I wouldn't mind some easier classes.
I think there's enough diversity of class types. There's less taxing ones and then more taxing ones. So in that regard, the student can really choose. But if you're a STEM student, you're going to be in more taxing classes. They could tone down a little on that. Most students I know here are overachievers, so they drive themselves down trying to do well in the classes. So making the curriculum a little lighter could be good.
Although it depends a lot on what field you're in, to be clear. If you're in biochemistry or you're in electrical engineering or mechanical engineering, it's actually quite a taxing curriculum. If you're in some of the humanities and social sciences, I would say it's not so demanding in general. I would hope that Harvard would spend a little more time trying to get faculty from across the various disciplines onto the same page about how much to expect from students. Computer science is traditionally one of the more demanding curricula, and it certainly was in the past. Even computer science is probably not as demanding a major as as electrical engineering or mechanical engineering is. I think there are other ways to get students focused on their work other than just making all the courses harder. The trouble with making a curriculum that's very demanding is you discourage students who otherwise might be interested in pursuing a field, and you drive them out and they go into a softer field that's not what they really wanted to do. So I think there's a downside to a very demanding curriculum, but I don't think that we are, for the most part, in a situation where our curriculum is too demanding as it is.
How do you grade your students? Who's the type of person that would get the highest grade in your class, and who's the type of person that would get the lowest?
Well, students who get the lowest grades in classes, and I'm just kind of averaging over all of the years that I've been teaching, are almost always students who are troubled or distracted in some way. They're just not focused on doing their academic work at all. I'm in the very fortunate position at Harvard that none of the students, and I mean zero, none of the students who come into my classroom are incapable of doing the work that I assign. Whether they have the inclination to do the work that I assign, or whether they have other things in their lives which may be more important than my work at a given moment is a different matter. I mean, I well remember having dinner with a student many years ago. I casually asked her if she did anything outside of class, and she told me she played the piano, and I said, well, that's very interesting. And I said, do you practice a lot? And she smiled and said, well, yes, I actually used to practice every day from when I was 5 years old up until your assignment 7 was due. I had broken her string of 20 years or something like this, or 15 years of consecutive daily piano practice. Turned out she was a concert pianist. Computer science was what she was studying, but she had a whole life as a performer that I had no way of knowing about. And I actually sort of backed off some of my rigor at that point in all of my teaching, because I recognize that people have other things going on in their lives. Students at the top, the very top, that's a very interesting question you have. The students at the very top of the grade scale are often not the most creative people. They're the people who are best at following rules. They will haggle for every point and argue with you and so on and so forth, make sure everything is completely perfect. I've had a number of students who graduated from Harvard with straight A averages, even at a time when we gave many fewer A's than we now do, who went into perfectly conventional jobs afterwards, and I'm sure did very well, but were never heard from again. And the really successful students I've had who've done something really creative, imaginative, or that required a lot of intense work and so on, they tended to be people who did very well, but they weren't necessarily number one in the class. Turns out if you're not in school, getting grades is not actually a valuable skill.
Do you believe the present-day Harvard Civics program accomplishes what you envision a civics course should be? Or do you think the Harvard Civics program still needs work to get things right?
I'm not aware that there is a Harvard Civics program. My guess is that a very large, an embarrassingly large number of Harvard students could not pass the citizenship exam that immigrants have to take before they become citizens. And I happen to know a little bit about that exam because my son-in-law teaches as on a volunteer basis, or teaches immigrants to pass it. I think we don't do nearly enough to prepare our students, many of whom go on to be congresspeople and leaders of industry and so on, what the responsibilities of being an American citizen are and how the government actually works. That's a criticism of Harvard that we could go on at some length about, but that's my view.
Do you believe the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action will be drastic on Harvard's future admissions? Has there been any noticeable change from this year's admissions process?
Well, it's too soon to know what the results are going to be on this year's admissions process, because we're speaking before those letters have gone out and before any announcement has been made about the composition of the class. And I used to be involved in Harvard admissions. I am no longer. I'm retired, so I'm not in any Harvard committees of any kind. It's a great question, however, how much things are really going to change. My guess is that it's not going to actually have that big a change on the composition of the class. And it's not because anybody's ignoring the dictates of the Supreme Court. It's because the pool of applicants is so amazingly deep. As long as you're picking on the basis of academic and extracurricular and personal quality criteria, there are good representatives of the qualities that we want Harvard students to have from all populations. Frankly, it's too soon to know. We won't know until we have the results, and we don't have the results yet.
Do students with connections have more leverage in being selected in Harvard's admissions process than students who don't have those same connections?
They're more visible. They get looked at closely, perhaps. I don't think it changes the outcome all that much. We have a very strong pool of students who are not children of alumni or children of donors or or anything else, if you wander around, you say you're interviewing students, you'll find that almost all the students are just kind of, normal students like anywhere else. One of the things, if I can just go off on this a little bit, there's this whole issue of, legacy, how it's so-called legacy. It's not what we call them, but, what advantage does it have to be the son or daughter of a graduate of Harvard College? Medical school and law school graduates are disappointed to learn that that doesn't make you a Harvard legacy for undergraduate admissions purposes. It's only children of Harvard College. But the real problem that is a dilemma in college admissions, how much of advantage that you're well educated in high school. Around the city of Boston, for example, my kids went to Brookline High School. They would get a really, really good education if they were motivated, and so at least they'd have the opportunity to get a really, really good education. If they lived 100 yards away on the Boston side of the river and went to the normal Boston public school system, their educational opportunities would be much less. That school system is much worse than the Brookline public school system is. So the thing about being the son or daughter of an alumnus of Harvard, there's an advantage that you have automatically because, or not automatically, but you're likely to have in the same way as being the son or daughter of any upper middle class family. Most Harvard graduates tend to be middle class or above, and you're more likely to be in Brookline than in Boston, or in Lexington than in Wichita. Sorry, I don't mean to dump on Wichita. My guess is that it's hard enough to get in now that you really have to separate the advantage of being upper middle class and the educational advantages that that's given you already by being probably in a good school district from these other allegedly personal tips that you get from having Harvard connections.
Do you have any out of the ordinary predictions on what computers will do in the future that have yet to be realized in the present day?
Yeah, lots happened, hasn't it? I'm not going to give you a direct answer to that question because I've been so lousy at predicting the future. If I could have predicted the future, even of my own students, I would be living in the Bahamas or something like that now rather than cold Massachusetts. But here's something I want to say about what's happening on the cutting edge of computer science and what concerns me. I hope people will stop arguing about whether the robots are eventually going to become superior beings and will wipe human life off the face of the earth because they will consider us dispensable and they will be superior beings. And the reason why I wish people would stop worrying about that is I want them to worry instead about what's actually going to happen, which is that evil people will use artificial intelligence in order to control everybody else. We are, of course, already seeing that happen with the use of deep fake videos of political candidates and other stuff that's going to try to swing electoral politics here and in other countries. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of opportunities to use the power of computers for nefarious purposes that are very hard to pin down. They're very hard to legislate because it's very hard to know exactly what it is that you are trying to prevent. Things that start off looking like innocent games can be the basis for technologies that can be used in very cruel and malign ways. So that's what I'm worried about. My worry about the future of computer technology is not that the computers are going to take over the world, but that bad people are going to take over the world with the effective use of computers.